It started, as many overlooked heists do, with a file left too long on a shelf. In the bowels of the British National Archives sits a thick folder labeled Case 1978 PRC, Attempted Theft, Kensington Palace. Dusty, unassuming, and mostly forgotten, it chronicles an attempted robbery so bizarre, so quietly doomed by its own planning, that most London tabloids gave it only a brief mention at the time. But for those who investigated it, the crime revealed not only the clumsiness of the perpetrators, but something far more fascinating, a deeply methodical flaw in how perfect crimes are imagined and why they so rarely work. Let's take you back. Round Pushpin location, Kensington Palace, London. Date, November 17, 1978. Time, 2:47 a.m. Weather, rainy 7 degrees C. Mild fog rolling over the palace gardens. At this time, parts of Kensington Palace had long since been converted to royal apartments and private offices, while others served as museums. It wasn't Buckingham's rigidly fortified atmosphere security existed, but it was more ceremonial than tactical. Motion sensors were limited, guards were rotated casually, and most damningly, the renovation wing was being gutted, wiring exposed, scaffolding scattered like bones. To three men who once worked as part of the contractor's crew, it seemed like the ideal opportunity. Busts in silhouette the cast of characters. Raymond Razor Flett, a small-time London thief with a penchant for historical memorabilia and whiskey, a former scaffolding technician who once worked inside the palace, fired for showing up drunk on the job. Colin Marsh, a clean-cut, quiet electrician with one prior conviction for petty theft, knew the layout of the wiring in the museum wing intimately. Jerry Wilkes, former stagehand at the Apollo Theater, known for disguises and illusions, notably once made an entire upright piano vanish during a children's magic show, later arrested for possession of counterfeit documents. Together, they formed a trio more suited to odd jobs than master theft. But desperation and a strange belief in their combined talents led them down a winding path toward Kensington. Hammer the plan. The concept was laughably simple in hindsight. Enter through the under-construction East Wing, using blueprints stolen from the construction firm's filing cabinet. Disable the security sensors which Colin believed were not yet wired in that section. Navigate through the sub-basement, climb up through a dumbwaiter shaft into the closed-off King's Gallery. Locate and extract three specific items. A Fabergé egg once owned by Tsar Nicholas II. An 18th century snuffbox made of solid gold. A handwritten letter from Queen Victoria to her daughter Beatrice. They even brought specialized gloves, a custom case lined with velvet and one disguise each, a janitor uniform, a royal guard's tunic, and strangely a full tuxedo. The tuxedo, later explained by Jerry, was for flair. Bricks where things started to crack. The first problem wasn't a sensor or a watchful guard, it was a ladder. Raymond, responsible for placing a ladder in the northeast corridor 2 days prior, hidden behind a loose panel, simply forgot. He meant to place it on a Tuesday. He didn't. Then he left town on Wednesday to visit a girlfriend in Devon. By the time the night of the heist arrived, the ladder was still in his garage. They discovered this only after making it into the corridor via a service tunnel. No ladder meant no vertical access to the first-floor window leading to the restricted area. So, they improvised. Improvising in crime is the enemy of silence. The audio that changed everything. It was 2:47 a.m. when a microphone in the staff kitchen, ironically being tested for future use in guided audio tour, picked up the faint sound of metallic clanging, followed by a soft grunt and the phrase, "Colin, you twit, hold the light steady, I nearly took my bloody nose off." That recording would later be played in court. Unbeknownst to the thieves, A junior curator doing inventory in a nearby wing staying late to avoid rush hour travel heard the odd sounds and called a supervisor. It was 3:10 a.m. by the time security responded, but that was enough. Jigsaw the discovery. Guards discovered Colin attempting to wedge open a dumbwaiter door with a crowbar that was, ironically, part of the palace's Victorian artifact display. Razor was found near the coachroom trying to explain, in an American accent, that he was a tourist with insomnia. Jerry Wilkes got the furthest. Dressed in his tuxedo, he wandered into a private hallway and was caught quietly sipping sherry from a decorative decanter. When questioned, he replied simply, "I'm the entertainment." Oncoming police car the aftermath, or lack thereof. None of the men had managed to steal a single item. In fact, they never even reached the secured rooms. But what made this story notable wasn't just the ineptitude. It was the bureaucracy that followed. Technically, the men hadn't broken into the museum wing. They were apprehended in a non-public area, yes, but before entering the target space. The dumbwaiter hadn't been pried open. The artifacts remained untouched. The microphone that picked up their voices wasn't legally authorized for surveillance at that time. For months, the case bounced between departments. Crown prosecutors couldn't decide whether to charge them under theft, trespassing, or intent to commit. Eventually, all three were fined, given community service, and most critically issued lifetime bans from all royal properties. None served jail time. Brain a crime of memory. The most unusual twist came 3 years later when an internal investigation into palace security revealed that Colin's assumption had been right. The sensors in the East Wing hadn't been operational on the night of the heist. They were tested the following week. If Raymond had remembered the latter, it's plausible, not certain, but plausible that they might have succeeded at least partially. But what does it say about a criminal endeavor when its failure hinges on forgetfulness? When you peel back the layers of a failed crime, especially one as quietly absurd as the attempted Kensington Palace theft, you often find a curious psychological residue. Beneath the surface-level blunders and comical miscalculations, there's almost always a deeper story, of overconfidence, of fractured friendships, and of how the desire to finally get it right can eclipse reality. This section traces what happened after that rainy November night, when 3 ill-equipped men made national news not for what they stole, but for what they never got close to touching. Clapperboard public perception versus private fallout. While tabloids gave the crime a few days of sarcastic headlines, the great royal fumble, tuxedo heist falls flat, palace job, the men who couldn't climb, the legal world didn't laugh. Not entirely. Behind the scenes, prosecutors struggled with the peculiar nature of the evidence. No locks had been picked, no items disturbed. The recorded audio, while incriminating in spirit, wasn't legally sanctioned under the guidelines of 1978 surveillance laws, and the only physical damage was a cracked service tunnel grate and a few scuffed floorboards likely unrelated. In the end, the Crown Prosecution Service charged the trio with trespass on protected property, possession of burglary tools with intent, obstruction of a palace staff member. Colin had inadvertently pinned a janitor's cart in place during his attempted escape. But it wasn't the courts that punished them most, it was each other. Jigsaw the fragmenting trio. Raymond Flett, the so-called ringleader, felt betrayed. He told investigators in his interview, a tape still archived, that Jerry was too bloody theatrical and Colin was never meant for crime. "I should have done it alone." He claimed he had 2 other backup plans and never got to use them. When asked what they were, he responded, "Wouldn't you like to know?" He faded into obscurity soon after, reportedly taking a job at a novelty bookstore in Norwich. Local reports suggest he once tried to sell a fake royal teacup for £300. No charges were filed. Colin Marsh, the quiet electrician, took it the hardest. His wife left him. His employer, a small electrical firm in Croydon, dismissed him within days. A few weeks later, his flat was burglarized, though nothing was stolen. Some believe it was an act of revenge, others think it was a warning. Years later, a local magazine reported that Colin moved to Wales, where he worked under an assumed name wiring fire alarms for rural schools. When asked about Kensington, he reportedly replied, "You ever stand 2 feet from history and still feel completely invisible?" Jerry Wilkes became a brief urban legend. For a time, he was the one people remembered, the man in the tuxedo sipping royal sherry. He gave 2 interviews, both unpaid, tried to publish a memoir, and even attempted to trademark the phrase, "I'm the entertainment." It didn't work. The book was never published, and he was later fined for impersonating a fire inspector in 1984. Magnifying glass tilted left the unasked questions. But among all the fallout, what most investigators quietly pondered wasn't the crime, it was the oddity of the plan's specific targets. The Fabergé egg, the gold snuff box, and the handwritten letter. Why those 3 items? In a palace filled with valuables, tapestries, paintings, historic weapons, why pick an egg, a box, and a letter? The answer, it turns out, lay buried in a footnote of a construction company memo. File Memo 44B, an overlooked lead. In early 1978, while the East Wing was being prepared for electrical rewiring, a security consultant named Janet Headley submitted a report detailing vulnerabilities in the display curation. In the report, she noted, cases 18, 22, and 31A, though historically significant, lack proper pressure sensors. Their cabinet design predates our current protective casing. In a targeted effort, they would be the most viable entry points for theft with minimal detection. Items 18, 22, and 31A. The Fabergé egg. The gold snuff box. The letter from Queen Victoria. This memo was considered internal and never shared with contractors. But here's the catch: Janet Headley's office was located on the mezzanine floor, directly above the break room used by the construction crew. According to one janitor, Raymond, used to smoke right under that vent every lunch break. It's believed that over weeks of passive eavesdropping, Raymond caught wind of her report. Brain a crime born from overheard intelligence. This wasn't a case of pure luck or random selection. It was misapplied information. Raymond had learned just enough to believe he had an edge, a detail so specific, so insider, it emboldened him beyond logic. But he misunderstood its significance. Janet's report was precautionary. The pressure sensors had since been upgraded, even if the cabinets hadn't. The memo was obsolete. This is where the case gains psychological texture, the line between cleverness and delusion. There's a phrase used by career investigators, insecure competence. It describes someone who believes their fragments of knowledge make them an expert while blind to the gaps in their understanding. Raymond Flett was the embodiment of this. Institutional response. In the months following the incident, security at royal residences, especially those partially open to the public, underwent quiet restructuring. Without drawing press attention, the following changes were implemented at Kensington. All vented mezzanine offices were retrofitted with white noise generators. Internal memos were moved to a secure digital archive, one of the earliest such transitions in a public British institution. A new policy called compartmentalization of vulnerability data was established. It restricted access to security weakness reports to a need-to-know basis. These shifts would later be studied in private security firms as case examples of reactive transparency control. In simple terms, learning to talk less where ears don't belong. ZZZ quiet consequences. The crime never inspired books or dramatizations. There was no shootout, no tense negotiations, no diamonds tumbling down staircases in slow motion. It was three men, a missing ladder, and a plan built on half-truths and bravado. And yet, for those who study crime seriously, it remains a curious footnote in the evolution of modern security policy. It asks a peculiar question. How often are the most harmless criminals the ones who nearly expose the most dangerous flaws? By the early 1990s, nearly everyone had forgotten about the attempted Kensington Palace heist. There were no anniversaries, no interviews, no Netflix docuseries. It hadn't even earned the tabloid immortality that follows more theatrical flops. But in hushed corners of law enforcement and museum security circles, the case still drifted like smoke, a cautionary tale of how oversight, miscommunication, and overconfidence collide behind polished walls and velvet ropes. To understand its true impact, though, you have to follow not just what happened that night, but how it reverberated in quiet, often personal ways. Performing arts: the vanishing of Jerry Wilkes. Of the three men involved, Jerry, the entertainer, Wilkes disappeared first and most literally. In 1987, he was arrested under suspicion of forging antique theater posters and selling them at flea markets across Essex. The charges didn't stick. The paper trail went cold. A single photograph of him wearing a fake monocle and bow tie, trying to mimic Niall Coward, was the last confirmed public image. By 1990, his name no longer appeared on electoral rolls. No tax filings, no utility bills, no vehicle registration. It was as if Jerry had leaned fully into the illusion he once wore as a disguise. Some believe he changed his name and moved to Spain. Others suggest he died in a fire in Blackpool that destroyed a boarding house he was rumored to frequent. No body was conclusively identified. The Metropolitan Police, when asked about his status in 2002, stated only, "Mr. Wilkes has no active warrants. We have no reason to believe he poses a threat to the public." But ask anyone who worked London's antique fraud units in the 80s, and they'll tell you. Jerry's out there, or at least someone who learned from him is. Electric Plug Colin's quiet redemption. Colin Marsh, the soft-spoken electrician, eventually resurfaced in the most unassuming of places, a monastery. Not as a monk, though some early reports guessed as much, but as a maintenance technician for an abbey in Powys, Wales. He used the name Christopher Marsh, and for years, no one knew his past. Then in 1996, a routine background check for a local council contract flagged his prior conviction. When approached by police, he didn't run. In fact, he offered tea. His statement, filed under low risk, no action required, included this line: "I never wanted anything royal. I just thought maybe if I could help someone do something big, I wouldn't feel so small." Colin kept the job. The abbey supported him. He eventually trained young apprentices, many of whom didn't learn about his past until much later. Among them was a 17-year-old named Samuel, who, in a BBC interview decades later, would recall, "He showed me how to trace old copper wiring without tearing walls down. But more than that, he showed me how to keep my name out of the papers." Books: Raymond's retrospective. Of the trio, Raymond Razor, Flett lived the longest and spoke the most. In 2005, a journalist writing a piece on Britain's most forgettable crimes managed to track him down. By then, he was 67, living in a caravan outside of Lowestoft, selling rare books and fake autographs. Raymond agreed to talk, but only under one condition: "Don't make me sound like an idiot." The resulting article was titled, "The Man Who Forgot His Ladder." Raymond didn't love the headline but admitted, "It's fair." He shared several things during that interview that were previously unknown. He did remember the ladder the day before the heist, but assumed Colin had handled it. He kept a sketch of the palace layout pinned to his caravan ceiling until the late 90s. He once revisited Kensington as a tourist in 1982 and got lost in the gift shop. The journalist asked him what he thought about the heist now. Raymond took a long sip of tea and said, "I think, if it had worked, we'd have ruined our lives a different way. It failing let us ruin 'em slower. That's probably better." He died in 2011. His obituary mentioned his love for puzzles, pub trivia, and an uncommonly deep knowledge of royal artifacts. Locked the long-term security impact. Behind the closed doors of British museum boards and palace security committees, the Kensington incident, as it was unofficially dubbed, had a surprisingly long shelf life. It wasn't taught as a story of crime prevention success. It was taught as a story of vulnerability exposure. Here's what changed long-term. Cross-departmental silence was discouraged. Curators, contractors, and consultants were no longer siloed. Weekly risk meetings were mandated across major historical institutions in the UK. Sound censor legal policy reform. Parliament quietly updated surveillance laws regarding publicly funded properties. Now, if sound recording is being tested in a non-public wing of a national site, a preemptive disclosure clause must be filed. Dry run risk modeling. Security firms began running failure-first simulations, i.e., assuming criminals already had insider knowledge or forgotten tools. If the scenario still failed, the plan was deemed secure. Kensington itself now maintains a small, unpublicized file titled Legacy Threat Case 78. It includes a copy of Janet Headley's memo, a transcript of the captured audio, and a still photo of Jerry Wilkes in his tuxedo sipping, smiling. The caption reads, "No damage, no theft, but a reminder human error is always the weakest point." Speech balloon final reflections. What makes a crime memorable? They didn't steal anything. They didn't break a display. They didn't even make it up the first flight of stairs. But in some strange way, Raymond, Colin, and Jerry became part of the palace's story ghosts in the gallery, footnotes in the margins of royal security history. There's a reason seasoned detectives often say, the cleverest crimes are the ones that didn't work. Because those failures, the quiet, bumbling, human ones, hold more truth about why people commit crimes than any mastermind thriller ever could. So ask yourself this as you drift off. Would the story have meant more if they'd succeeded? Or does it mean more because they did? In the summer of 1993, a mid-sized plastics company in Manchester realized it had been paying an employee for nearly 6 years someone who didn't exist. The discovery wasn't made by auditors, nor by management, nor even by human resources. It came from a freshly hired intern, a 22-year-old university student named Ellie Brooks, who was tasked with updating a spreadsheet of employee birthdays for an internal newsletter. She couldn't find a single photograph, document, or an office interaction tied to one name. Jonathan Westfield. The name sounded familiar. Several people in accounting had emailed him. Others claimed to have received memos he signed. But no one could remember meeting him. No one had seen him on the factory floor. And when Ellie checked the employee ID database, his photo field was blank. It was strange, then it got stranger. Office building the company, Northertech Plastics Limited. Northertech wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Located in the industrial outskirts of Manchester, it manufactured injection-molded parts for everything from car dashboards to kitchen bins. With around 300 employees and a modestly rotating staff, it wasn't unusual for some names to get lost in the mix, especially those who worked hybrid office jobs. At least, that's how management initially explained Jonathan Westfield's absence. According to payroll records, he had been hired in March of 1987 as a junior financial analyst, promoted to senior payroll accountant by 1991, and oddly given partial work-from-home privileges in 1992 due to chronic respiratory illness. At the time, this was uncommon but not unheard of. There were a handful of employees who worked remotely, often due to disability, travel, or other accommodations. Westfield's name appeared on expense approvals, quarterly departmental breakdowns, emails to HR regarding staffing ratios. He wasn't high-ranking, but he had presence digitally. File folder Ellie's growing suspicion. At first, Ellie assumed it was a tech glitch. She contacted HR and requested Jonathan Westfield's personnel file. That's when things took a darker turn. No national insurance number was listed. His home address was a P.O. box in Leeds. His listed landline had been disconnected for 2 years. His bank account, where salary had been deposited monthly, was through a private international bank in the Channel Islands. And finally, his hearing manager, a woman named Evelyn Cross who had died in a car accident in 1989. Magnifying glass tilted left internal inquiry, a corporate hall of mirrors. Ellie brought her findings to her supervisor, who in turn notified senior finance. A quiet internal inquiry was launched. They started by tracing Westfield's payroll deposits. The total paid from 1987 to 1993 amounted to £216,000. The bank account existed sort of. It was real, yes, but registered under a shell company, Newgate Solutions Limited, incorporated in the Isle of Man in 1986 and dissolved in 1990. The company had no assets, no active directors, and no filings after that year, but the bank account remained open, quietly receiving funds. Every month the same amount, sometimes with minor bonuses or cost of living increases, just like other employees. So who was behind the withdrawals? The bank, citing offshore privacy laws, initially refused to release information. But after pressure from Northertech's legal team and hints of potential fraud investigations, they offered a redacted statement. What they provided shocked everyone. The funds had been withdrawn in full, every quarter, by someone using an identity verification method tied to Evelyn Cross. Brain, how does a ghost manage payroll? To outsiders, this story might sound too strange to be real. But to internal fraud investigators, it followed a known, albeit rare, pattern. The phantom employee scheme. It works like this. A real employee, often in HR or finance, creates a fake profile for someone who never existed. They set up payroll, assign duties, and even simulate emails or approvals from that person. Funds are diverted to accounts that the fraudster controls, often under pseudonyms or shell companies. To protect the illusion, they use impersonation techniques or tie the fake employee to someone who can no longer speak for themselves. In this case, Evelyn Cross, the hearing manager who had died in 1989, was the only person who had allegedly met Jonathan Westfield in person. But there was a deeper problem. Evelyn Cross wasn't just the hearing manager. She had been Northertech's head of payroll. Jigsaw the Evelyn factor. Investigators now had to consider a grim possibility. Was Evelyn Cross, revered for her loyalty and professionalism, behind the entire scheme? It fit a potential timeline. 1987, she creates the identity of Jonathan Westfield. 1989, she dies but the payments continue. 1990, the shell company is dissolved, perhaps intentionally. 1991 onward, no one questions it because Jonathan is now considered remote, working off-site due to illness. But if Evelyn had orchestrated the fraud, who continued it after her death? Bank withdrawals still occurred, emails from Westfield still appeared, someone was keeping the ghost alive. Adult laptop, a clue in the code. Enter Kevin Du Maurier, Northertech's aging IT administrator. In 1993, company emails were routed through a rudimentary internal system called microframe, a DOS-based interface that tracked usernames and timestamps. When Kevin examined the email trail for Westfield's account, he noticed two things. All messages were sent between 11:30 p.m. and 3:00 a.m. The terminal ID matched a machine in the maintenance supply closet, 3 floors below the accounting office. The machine didn't have a proper user chair. It was shoved into a corner next to unused filing cabinets. Only 2 people had keys to that room, one of whom had been let go during layoffs in 1992. The other, Howard Gill, a senior night janitor. The man behind the ghost. Howard Gill was 58, soft-spoken, and had worked at Northertech for 19 years. When questioned, he didn't deny anything, but he didn't confirm much either. All he said was, "I was just keeping the lights on for her." When asked to elaborate, he claimed Evelyn had been kind to him, gave him extra shifts, once covered a mistake on his time card. He refused to say whether she asked him to continue the fraud or whether he did it on his own. In the end, Gill was quietly dismissed. No charges were filed. Northertech was desperate to avoid scandal. The matter was settled with a non-disclosure agreement and a lump sum payment. Receipt, what was it all for? The most haunting detail came weeks later when Ellie, the intern who had discovered it all, checked Jonathan Westfield's expense account one last time. In 1992, a reimbursement request had been filed from his alleged P.O. box address for 2 wreaths, a condolence card, a donation to a local cancer hospice, all marked in memory of Evelyn Cross. The forms were signed again by Jonathan Westfield, the man who never existed. So the question remains, did Evelyn create Westfield to steal from the company? Or did someone else create him to keep her alive? Some crimes are hard to solve because of what's missing: fingerprints, footage, witnesses. Others are hard to solve because of what's still there. Ghosts in the system. A name that continues to collect a salary. Emails that keep appearing at odd hours. A crime that outlives its creator. After the quiet internal investigation at Northertech Plastics Limited, wrapped in the summer of 1993, executives moved quickly to hush the incident. No press release, no police, just a reshuffling of access permissions, a severed bank connection, and a retroactive audit that never quite answered the one thing everyone kept asking. Who was Jonathan Westfield? And why did the lie continue years after its alleged creator died? Brain revisiting the Evelyn Cross theory. When the scandal first broke inside the company, the assumption was that Evelyn Cross, the now-deceased head of payroll, had created Westfield. After all, she had the access. She had the authority. She had the motive if there was one. But the more closely the few remaining auditors looked, the more inconsistencies they found. Key points that didn't line up. The hearing form for Jonathan Westfield was dated March 1987, but Evelyn wasn't promoted to head of payroll until June of that year. The account that received the salary payments was created under Newgate Solutions Limited, a company Evelyn had no traceable link to. Multiple login points for Westfield's digital presence were recorded after Evelyn's death, some of them coming from locations far outside Manchester, including 2 access logs from a public library in Oxford. So either Evelyn had help or someone had used her position, even her identity, as a mask for their own scheme. Which raised a new possibility. What if Evelyn wasn't the architect? What if she was the first victim? Card the envelope in the archive. In 1994, 1 year after the ghost employee was scrubbed from Northertech's payroll system, a facilities clerk cleaning out a disused filing cabinet found an envelope marked to be opened in event of audit, JW. It had been sealed, stamped with the Northertech logo and filed under Inactive Projects 1989. Inside were 5 items. A handwritten note addressed to Ellis Later, identified as Ellis Briggs, Evelyn's assistant. A floppy disk labeled Q3 Analysis Remote Terminal. A printed photograph of a young man in glasses, sitting at a desk. A company ID badge expired for Jonathan Westfield. A second note typed in unsigned titled, "They Know." The handwriting on the first note matched Evelyn's known samples. It read, "Ellis, if this ever becomes a problem, say nothing. The truth isn't in the books. They'll look in the wrong place. If they ask about Jonathan, tell them he was real. Just not here." That last line would puzzle analysts for years. Floppy disk, the floppy disk. The disk was examined by Kevin Du Maurier, the same IT administrator who helped trace Westfield's email terminal. What he found was, well, unusual. Instead of spreadsheets or financial analysis, the disk contained a full log of Westfield's email inbox and outbox from 1987 to 1989. A batch of memos addressed to senior staff, all of them appeared legitimate, properly formatted and time-stamped. A short text file labeled simply, "Reminders." That file contained 8 lines. Schedule invoices by Wednesday. Evelyn likes jasmine tea, not green. Do not approve Paul M's travel claim duplicate. Terminal 6's keyboard sticks. If Ellis asks again, tell him I was at the pub. The hospice called. Shred old forms, especially bin 3. Stay small, stay quiet. It was that last line that stuck with investigators. Stay small, stay quiet. Was it a mantra, a warning, instructions from someone else? Detective Mail, the outside consultant. In 1995, Northertech brought in a private forensic accountant named Margaret Lenley, known for her work on internal corporate fraud cases. She was instructed to perform a deep dive into the ghost payroll case, under strict confidentiality. Her conclusion, chilling in its clarity: the fraud is not the story. The story is how many people sustained it without fully understanding it. Evelyn may have started it, but someone or multiple someones chose to continue it. Margaret identified at least 3 separate digital fingerprints used to maintain the Jonathan Westfield profile. The original, Evelyn's login credentials. The second, a temporary intern login from 1990. The third, a wildcard admin credential from IT, used sparingly but always between 2-4 a.m. And then she asked a question no one wanted to answer. Why was it so important that Jonathan Westfield stayed employed, even after the fraud's value became negligible? Briefcase, the soft leverage theory. One theory Margaret proposed, one never published or shared beyond Northertech's board, was this. Someone inside the company learned about Evelyn's creation of Westfield. Rather than report it, they took control of it. Not to get rich, but to create leverage. In this version of events, the ghost employee wasn't just a vehicle for stealing money. He was a pressure point, a trap waiting to be sprung. Anyone who questioned it could be implicated. Anyone who helped sustain it became part of a quiet conspiracy, willing or not. That kind of leverage is subtle, powerful, and near impossible to trace. But it's also fragile. Because all it takes is one intern, cross-referencing birthday spreadsheets, to unravel it. Abacus, the final balance. When the books were closed on the Westfield file, the final numbers told a story that defied easy categorization. £216,000 in salary paid. £73,000 in expense claims. 47 confirmed emails sent under his name. 9 separate line managers who believed they'd interacted with him. 1 P.O. box that, when finally investigated, contained only subscription magazines and a single holiday card from 1988. To Jonathan, with thanks for making the numbers disappear. E. Bust in silhouette, a crime without a criminal. No one was charged. No one confessed. No one ever came forward to claim authorship of the scheme. Internally, Northertech changed its hearing policies. Anonymous audits became routine. Remote employees were required to verify location and presence via scheduled video calls. The IT department implemented software that flagged accounts with prolonged login windows outside normal business hours. But the cultural scar ran deeper. For years after, employees would refer to unexplained software glitches as a Westfield, as in, the printer's having a Westfield again, spitting out old reports. And Ellie Brooks, the intern who discovered it all. She didn't stay in accounting. She became a forensic auditor, eventually joining the National Crime Agency. In her first published paper, she wrote, "People think fraud is a loud thing. It's not. It's quiet, procedural, deliberate. It hides in forms, memos, and assumptions. It hides in people's need to believe they know who works next to them." So then we ask, was Westfield just a glitch in the system? Or was he the system's reflection? A composite of everything we don't want to notice until it costs too much to ignore. There's a peculiar emptiness that surrounds certain crimes, not the chaos of robbery or the violence of an assault, but the eerie stillness of fraud. When a theft is so quiet, so clean, so methodically boring that even after it's discovered, you can't quite locate the fingerprints, or the criminal, or the motive. The case of Jonathan Westfield was one of those. But what made it stranger and more haunting was this. Long after the payments stopped, long after the audits ended and the access was revoked, Jonathan kept showing up. Printer the phantom print job. In 1997, 4 years after the internal investigation officially concluded, a junior IT staffer named Sam Patel opened the Northertech mainframe's print queue to diagnose a routine hardware lag. Buried at the bottom of the job list, backlogged behind a jammed toner request, was a print order. File name, Westfield Tax Filing 94 Docs. Source terminal, Workstation 42B, retired and disconnected in 1995. Timestamp, 02:38 a.m. The document never printed. It simply sat in queue, repeating every few weeks like a ghost knocking on a locked door. Patel assumed it was a corrupted remnant of a past file, but after being warned by older staff not to go poking the Westfield thing, he archived the job and logged it without action. It was the first of 11 identical jobs logged between 1997 and 2002, each from non-existent terminals, always between 2:00 and 3:00 a.m., and always with slight changes to the file name. Some were labeled Jonathan 94 Card Statement Docs, Evelyn Final Balance 1990 DocX, Mid-Year Expense Recon Docs. They were never printed, never opened, just there. Digital ripples of something that shouldn't have been. Locked with key, the disconnected account that was. In 2003, an external firm contracted to overhaul Northertech's legacy systems made a peculiar discovery. A single user profile was still active in the email backend, not listed in any current staff index, not visible to front-facing software. The profile, J. Westfield at Nortech Co. UK. When it pulled the access logs, they found 13 logins per year. Always remote. Always within a 15-minute window. No sent emails, no inbox content, but a single draft email that auto-deleted itself every 90 days. One version of the draft was captured during a system snapshot. It read, "I am not the lie, I am the memory of it. That's harder to delete." Investigators at the time were unsure whether to classify it as a cyber breach, a hardware echo, or simply a very elaborate leftover artifact. The login stopped entirely in 2004. The account was terminated, or so they thought. Mirror crimes in other companies. By 2005, similar cases began surfacing, not always publicized, but well known in auditor circles. A food manufacturing plant in Derbyshire discovered an employee receiving hazard pay who hadn't worked on-site since 1998. A transport company in Glasgow had 4 field analysts on payroll who were all, it turned out, the same person fabricated using slight spelling variations in the name. A Leeds insurance agency reported pension payouts to an employee who had died, only to find the name had never been legally registered at all. In several of these cases, Northern was cited in internal briefings as the precedent for how hard it was to root out fraud not committed by a person, but by a pattern. Because once an idea like Jonathan Westfield enters a system, it behaves like malware, self-replicating, hard to trace, and often operating under the radar of what people expect crime to look like. Male who was behind it. To this day, no confirmed individual has taken responsibility for the scheme, but 3 suspects never formally accused emerged as the most likely candidates. 1 Evelyn Cross, payroll head, deceased. Motive: control over payroll and possible financial pressure from a sibling's medical debts. Evidence: created the hearing paperwork, connection to the bank account, authored internal memos referencing Westfield. Counterpoint: died in 1989, yet Westfield's activities continued for 15 years beyond her death. 2 Howard Gill, night janitor, terminated. Motive: loyalty to Evelyn, long-term access to terminal rooms. Evidence: admitted to keeping the lights on for her, had keys to the room used in nighttime logins. Counterpoint: lacked the technical skill to create email automation, manipulate files, or maintain digital presence long-term. 3 Unknown IT department insider. Motive: leverage, insider access to legacy systems, ability to manipulate audit logs. Evidence: logins and email activity suggest technical fluency, use of wildcard admin accounts. Counterpoint: no named individual ever confirmed or linked directly, could have been multiple people over time. Receipt: the final audit. In 2007, on the brink of a merger with a multinational plastics firm, Northern commissioned one last audit: a deep cleanse of all digital and paper records. The auditor's final report was sealed, but a leaked summary included this paragraph. The Westfield anomaly demonstrates how human systems, even those protected by regulation and oversight, remain vulnerable to long-term narrative fraud. When a lie is seeded with just enough detail, it stops being questioned and starts being filed. Following the report, the company introduced strict biometric logins, eliminated remote-only roles, and fully digitized all personnel files. But none of it undid the past. Open mailbox with raised flag, the letter that arrived too late. In 2011, years after the system was purged, a letter arrived at Northern's HR office. Typed on old stationery, postmarked from an unknown sender in Sheffield. Inside was a single page. If you're reading this, then the system has done its job. Jonathan Westfield was never meant to be a person. He was a placeholder. A blind spot you all agreed not to look at too closely. We didn't steal anything. We accounted for what was missing. You're welcome. JW. The letter was forwarded to corporate legal, then quietly shredded. Brain reflection: the weight of invisible crimes. The Westfield case isn't about a dramatic theft. There was no vault, no late-night getaway, no high-profile arrest. It's a story about what people overlook when something becomes part of the background noise. The form no one questions. The memo everyone assumes someone else read. The name on the list no one remembers meeting. It's the kind of crime that doesn't scream, it whispers. And those whispers don't end with an arrest. They linger. They replicate. They get copied into systems, into habits, into the assumptions we use to make work easier. So as you lie back and drift off, consider this. How many Jonathan Westfields are out there right now, quietly collecting pay, avoiding meetings, never getting caught? And maybe, more importantly, would we even want to catch them? On a gray November morning in 2006, customs officials at the Blaine border crossing between British Columbia and Washington state opened a suspicious package that had been flagged by a shipping clerk. It was a large, reinforced crate. Not unusual in itself, packages of that size pass through every day, especially from the Pacific Northwest's bustling import-export zone. What made it odd was what wasn't on it. No commercial sender, no internal paperwork, no visible barcode or customs declaration. And yet, somehow, the crate had made it across 3 freight terminals, onto a transport truck, and within 30 feet of clearing U.S. customs. When border officials unbolted the lid, they didn't find weapons, or drugs, or electronics. They found a woman, wrapped in blankets, wearing noise-canceling headphones, sitting atop a plastic cooler containing medication, water, granola bars, and a printed binder titled Border Crossing Procedure Plan A. The woman gave her name as Teresa Doyle. But it would take months and a global investigation to figure out who she really was, and why she had chosen to disappear into a box. Who was Teresa Doyle? According to the shipping manifest, handwritten, found tucked inside the crate, Teresa was listed as Mechanical Cargo Prototype Housing Unit. A warehouse worker in Surrey, BC, had logged it as fragile, no tip, unaware it contained a person. No one at the shipping company remembered interacting with a woman fitting Teresa's description. When questioned, she remained calm. She explained that she was attempting to immigrate to the U.S. without using a passport, not to avoid the law but to escape what she called a system that doesn't recognize the quietly endangered. Officials assumed mental illness. She was held for psychiatric evaluation for 48 hours, but what emerged instead was a profile unlike anything the Department of Homeland Security had ever encountered. Receipt a life of near invisibility. Teresa Doyle, if that was her real name, had no active Canadian social insurance number, no digital banking record, no government-issued ID since 1998. But she wasn't homeless, she wasn't unwell. In fact, she had been living in a rental unit under a sublet agreement for over 11 years, paying in cash, working under-the-table administrative jobs, and according to one former roommate, keeping entirely to herself. She had a library card. She mailed birthday cards to her landlord's children. She subscribed to Scientific American. And yet, to the Canadian government, she hadn't officially existed in over a decade. Her last recorded activity was a hospital visit in 1999 for a sprained wrist listed under her original name, Marion Doyle. File folder: the name change no one authorized. Digging deeper, investigators uncovered that Marion Doyle had legally changed her name to Teresa in 1997, but the paperwork was incomplete. The application was filed, but never picked up. Her birth certificate was flagged as pending update, and then forgotten in the province's backlog during a transition to digital records. This created a bureaucratic anomaly. Legally, she was still Marion. Functionally, she was Teresa. In the system, she was neither. Which meant no passport, no tax filings, no insurance, no eligibility for government aid or pension. She had fallen into a documentary blind spot, and for reasons still unknown at the time, she chose not to correct it. When asked by a border official why, she responded, "Because the error kept me safe until it didn't." Package: how do you ship a person? The logistics of Teresa's journey were staggering in their precision. The crate was custom-built, lined with foam insulation, and vented through disguised slats on each side. A rechargeable battery pack powered an internal fan and 2 low-voltage lights. She carried a UV pen, a handwritten escape plan, and a folded copy of the U.S. Naturalization Act. A GPS tracker, glued under the crate's floor, was set to send location updates via a cheap burner phone placed outside the box before sealing. Teresa had timed her journey to last 36 hours, with temperature-stable food and electrolyte powder. She had even run 3 test shipments using weighted crates filled with dummy packages. Border officials, stunned, couldn't decide whether they were dealing with an amateur smuggler or a reluctant genius. The head of the Blaine port described it this way: "We've had narcotics stuffed in teddy bears. We've had people try to forge diplomatic plates. But this was someone opting out of modern life and mailing herself to a better one. Prohibited, not a crime technically. The legal problem: she hadn't committed a clear-cut crime. She had not attempted to enter the country under false identification. She had not bribed, coerced, or deceived an immigration official. She had presented herself at a lawful point of entry, albeit in a crate, and declared her intent to seek asylum. Legally, it was as if she'd walked across the border and asked for help. Except she hadn't walked. She had ridden inside a sealed shipping container, avoiding scanners, detection, and regulation. It was unprecedented. Scroll a binder full of intentions. Inside her border crossing procedure binder, authorities found a timeline of her planned re-entry into the workforce, including resumes and job prospects. A journal detailing her descent into bureaucratic exile. A hand-sketched map showing alternate border crossings in case her crate was rerouted. But perhaps most disturbing or admirable, depending on one's perspective, was a 13-page legal brief titled, "A Case for Stateless Compassion: Why Bureaucracy is Not Sovereignty." The essay was well-written, footnoted, and cited obscure immigration rulings from both Canadian and U.S. courts. It argued that she was neither a fugitive nor a migrant but a documentary orphan, someone lost not by geography but by paperwork failure. She wrote, "I did not flee a country. I fled a folder that no longer contained my name. I fled the silence that comes when systems can't decide what to call you. I mailed myself to a place that might. Magnifying glass tilted left, why not just fix it?" Perhaps the most persistent question was the simplest. Why didn't Teresa just go to the proper office and fix her documents? Her answer: because after 10 years without a record, the burden of proof is no longer mine. The burden becomes too large, too layered, too expensive. You become guilty by default, not of crime, but of absence. She claimed she had tried 4 separate times between 2002 and 2005 to re-enter the system. Each attempt ended in a loop of missing ID, unaccepted copies, and dead-end appointments. Each rejection pushed her deeper into invisibility. So she turned to logistics, not rebellion. She built a way out with plywood, receipts, and legal loopholes. Brain: the Psychology of Disappearance. A forensic psychologist who interviewed Teresa during her evaluation concluded, "She is not mentally ill. She is rational to a degree that borders on unsettling. Her disappearance was not emotional, it was mathematical. She found a solution and executed it with minimal friction. It's society that finds her story strange, not her." In short, Teresa had gamed the bureaucracy. So now we ask, when the system forgets you, are you still obligated to remember it? Teresa Doyle spent just under 41 hours inside the crate. Temperature-controlled, strategically fed, briefly asleep. And completely alone. That time, 2 nights and a day became the subject of national curiosity after her story leaked to the press. How had she managed to survive the physical and mental strain? Why risk something so dangerous, so humiliating, just to cross a border legally? But according to Teresa, the crate wasn't a prison. It was the only space in the world that matched my legal existence. Quiet, unobserved, boxed in. She didn't see it as a desperate stunt. She saw it as a method, one she had planned with precise calculations. And the more investigators unpacked her journey, the more they realized. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a strategy. The journey itself. Teresa's crate began its voyage in Surrey, British Columbia, from a logistics depot just outside Vancouver. It was dropped off by a man she hired via a classified ad. She paid him in cash and instructed him to treat it as fragile prototype materials. The crate was shipped through a regional freight center where it waited for 6 hours, a transfer terminal where it was scanned superficially and moved to a consolidated truck, a night freight run headed to the U.S. border at Blaine, WA. Inside the box, Teresa had a carbon dioxide monitor, cooling packs to regulate internal temperature, a urinal bottle system she modified herself, a padded seat bolted to the crate's interior, an emergency release lever just in case. The only flaw in her timing came when the truck was delayed at a logistics checkpoint, where a broken scanning belt led to a 5-hour delay, pushing her journey over 40 hours. When asked how she stayed calm inside the crate, she replied, "I don't panic in silence. People do that, systems don't, and I'd rather trust a box than a bureaucracy." Receipt: the binder, revisited. In Section 1, we mentioned the binder found inside Teresa's crate, but its contents went far beyond procedural instructions. Investigators cataloged the following: pre-written emails, intended to be sent once she reached her destination, a list of pro bono immigration lawyers she had researched and ranked, a budget spreadsheet for 3 months of rent, food, and legal fees assuming asylum was denied, and a folded page with 4 names people she considered her safe contacts if anything went wrong. 3 of those names were from online forums related to stateless persons, where users often anonymously shared information on navigating life without government recognition. The 4th was a librarian in Tacoma, Washington, who later told reporters, "She once asked me if we had any books on the philosophy of maps. I thought she was eccentric. Turns out, she was planning to disappear and reappear without ever leaving a trail." Adult balance: legal limbo. Once detained at the U.S. border, Teresa was not arrested. Instead, she was held under a deferred inspection status, a little-known provision for asylum seekers with questionable documentation but no apparent criminal history. Over the next 6 weeks, she was housed in a transitional holding facility, where immigration lawyers, psychologists, and policy experts debated what to do with her. 3 major questions emerged. Was Teresa a Canadian citizen? Technically, yes, but her incomplete documentation, inactive SIN, and unrecognized identity made this hard to prove or enforce. Had she committed fraud? Not exactly. She hadn't used forged papers or assumed anyone else's identity. She was herself, just undocumented. Could she legally request asylum? She wasn't fleeing persecution, war, or violence, the usual grounds for asylum. But she was fleeing a bureaucratic void, something that, while not traditionally protected, raised urgent ethical concerns. Balance: the legal gray zone. Teresa's case sparked heated debate in immigration law circles. A symposium at the University of Washington titled stateless in the age of systems, used her case as a framework to explore new types of digital exclusion. A key speaker, civil rights attorney Amanda Hollies, said, "We've always thought of statelessness as geographical a result of war or collapsing regimes. But what happens when the loss of identity comes not from politics, but paperwork?" Teresa wasn't denied her rights. She just stopped being someone the system could see. Hollies filed an amicus brief in support of Teresa's petition for conditional residency. It argued that Teresa was not seeking to circumvent the system, she was, paradoxically, trying to return to it. Female, the woman behind the silence. Reporters swarmed the story as it broke nationwide. But Teresa refused interviews. She declined profile pieces, media contracts, even a book offer. One reporter from the Seattle Times managed a brief exchange before being turned away. She asked Teresa, "Are you ashamed?" Teresa replied, "Not of mailing myself. I'm ashamed I had to." Memo: the courtroom statement. In April 2007, Teresa appeared before an immigration judge in Seattle. Representing herself with her research binder in hand, she read a prepared statement that ended with this: "We design borders to manage chaos, but they are maintained by assumption. That people carry papers, that those papers match databases, that mistakes can always be corrected. But I am here because none of those assumptions held. I did not come to disappear, I came to reappear, to climb out of a crate and into a system that had left me in storage." The judge, visibly moved, deferred the case pending further review and offered her temporary legal standing under humanitarian exception protocol. It was the first time that clause had ever been applied to a case involving self-shipment. Magnifying glass tilted, right, a movement begins. After Teresa's story went public, forums and advocacy groups began tracking similar cases. A man in Italy, who lived 17 years without documents after a clerical error listed him as deceased. A woman in Louisiana, whose birth certificate was invalidated during a system digitization, leaving her unable to marry or drive. A family in Ireland, who existed for a decade without health access due to a visa mix-up between siblings. Teresa had become a symbol not of defiance, but of documentation failure. The woman in the crate who showed how easy it was to become lost on paper, even when standing in plain sight. So ask yourself this before we continue: how many people are living in systems that no longer acknowledge they exist? And what would you do if the only way to be seen again was to ship yourself into the light? In the months following her courtroom statement, Teresa Doyle became the unwilling face of a problem no one had the vocabulary for yet. Not a refugee, not a fugitive, not even a whistleblower. She was simply misplaced. Not physically, but systemically. By the summer of 2007, she had been granted provisional residency status in the United States under what officials termed a non-precedent humanitarian exemption. The language was intentionally cautious. Immigration authorities didn't want to set a repeatable model. They feared her case might encourage others to mimic her method. And yet people did. Envelope copycat cases. Within 18 months, 5 similar attempts were reported. A 19-year-old man in Oregon attempted to cross into Canada in a modified camper trailer outfitted with fake shipping invoices. A mother and son from Belarus tried to enter Germany inside an industrial refrigerator box marked, "Hazardous materials do not open." In Melbourne, Australia, a man was discovered in a shipping container addressed to a private residence, with only a fan, dried fruit, and a small legal packet citing Teresa Doyle's case by name. Authorities around the world, alarmed by the trend, dubbed it self-mailing migration. But what most of these imitators misunderstood was that Teresa hadn't mailed herself to avoid identification. She did it to force identification, to make her legal erasure visible by turning herself into a literal delivery. She wasn't running from anything. She was confronting a system that had passively removed her. Clipboard Teresa's life after the box. Once legally permitted to remain in the U.S., pending full citizenship review, Teresa declined all housing offers from non-profit organizations. Instead, she rented a one-bedroom apartment in Olympia, Washington, near the university library. She took a job part-time as an archival assistant, helping digitize public records. Those who met her described her as soft-spoken, ruthlessly precise, polite but emotionally insulated. One coworker recalled, she once corrected a 1982 file date by citing a bus schedule. That kind of mind. Despite her notoriety, Teresa actively avoided attention. When asked to speak at legal conferences or policy panels, she always replied with a version of the same message. I did not do this to be known. I did this so I wouldn't be lost. Open mailbox with raised flag, the files she left behind. In 2010, 3 years after gaining provisional legal residency, Teresa voluntarily submitted a binder to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services titled Post-Delivery Status Doyle T. The binder included detailed documentation of her employment, taxes, and legal compliance, a timeline of all attempts to restore her identity in Canada, a philosophical essay titled The Algorithm and the Absent Citizen, where she explored how digitized governance can dehumanize error. One particularly chilling excerpt reads, in analog systems, a lost form means a delay. In digital systems, a lost record means non-existence. There is no clerk to ask for help, only a void of validation. The binder was quietly filed. Teresa was granted a 10-year permanent residency card. No ceremony, no speech. Open mailbox with lowered flag, the letter to Canada. Perhaps the most poignant document was a single letter Teresa addressed to the Vital Statistics Office in British Columbia, postmarked but never confirmed received. It read, "To whom it may concern, this is to inform you that the person once known as Marion Doyle no longer requires reinstatement. She was replaced not by another identity but by circumstance. Your error was never malicious, just indifferent. But indifference is not a neutral position. Please close the file. I have found somewhere else to be real." No reply was ever documented. Brain a shift in thinking. Teresa's case quietly reshaped immigration policy in ways that most governments never publicly acknowledged. Legal scholars began referring to paperless citizens, individuals technically born within nations, but rendered functionally stateless by system collapse, misplaced documentation, or prolonged administrative failure. The term bureaucratic displacement gained academic traction. By 2012, U.S. immigration training manuals included an internal memo under low-visibility exceptional cases, referencing Teresa's case as an example of unintentional documentary exclusion, self-remedied through atypical, non-hostile entry. It wasn't quite praise, but it was acknowledgement. Luggage where she went. In 2016, Teresa's apartment lease wasn't renewed. She left Olympia, no forwarding address, no public records. A librarian at Evergreen State College said she donated 2 books before departing. The Shipping News by Annie Proulx. The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. Inside the second book was a post-it note that read, I was not cargo. I was declaration. Her Social Security activity, shows a final employment entry in 2017. Then nothing. No death certificate. No arrest. No missing person report. It's as if she stepped off the grid, but this time by choice. Package reflections: when the system is the crime. Teresa Doyle never broke the law. She followed it obsessively, even when it failed her. She bent every rule just enough to stay within the lines of technical legality. But what she really exposed was the assumption of identity permanence. We like to believe our names, our numbers, our documents represent us permanently. But systems fail, files corrupt. And when they do, when you become the anomaly, you either wait for the system to notice, or you find a way to ship yourself back into visibility. Teresa did just that. So as you listen to the quiet creak of a world still ruled by paperwork and policy, ask yourself, if no one sees you, no one records you, and no one acknowledges your name, are you still real? And if not, would you find a box and mail yourself back into the world? In the middle of a dry, hot summer in central Kansas, 1998, a pilot with the Department of Agriculture was conducting an aerial survey of drought-affected farmland when he noticed something odd. Nestled between rows of brittle corn and parched wheat sat a field in full bloom, vibrant yellow sunflowers, stretching for nearly 17 acres, bordered with perfect precision and gleaming under the punishing sun. Odd but not suspicious. Kansas is the sunflower state after all, but what puzzled the pilot wasn't what he saw, it was where. According to federal land use maps, no agricultural activity had been registered in that area for over 15 years. The land was listed as abandoned under the Rural Water Reallocation Act. There were no farm permits, no crop reports, no irrigation records. Yet here stood a lush, thriving crop, watered, fertilized, and clearly maintained. When the images were passed to local authorities for follow-up, they assumed it was an honest mistake, a paperwork error, maybe a family farm running informally. But by the time officials arrived on foot 2 days later, the entire field was gone. Not harvested, not burned, just gone. Nothing but dry, rutted dirt where the sunflowers had been. And so began what would later be quietly classified as Operation Sunflower, a slow-burning investigation into a land fraud scheme that would expose one of the most creative agricultural crimes in U.S. history. The field that shouldn't have existed. The parcel of land in question lay just outside the town of Hanover, Kansas, population 685. Officially, it belonged to the Department of the Interior, under a land bank program that held thousands of unused rural acres for potential environmental restoration. This particular lot had been flagged as unsuitable for farming due to soil toxicity caused by a nitrate spill in the 1980s. No one had applied for temporary lease. No one had filed for a water permit. No one in town claimed to have worked the land. So who planted those sunflowers? And more importantly, why remove them so quickly? Detective initial investigation, nothing to see. The first boots on the ground were from the Kansas Department of Agriculture Compliance Unit, who found fresh tire tracks, likely from small transport vehicles. Irrigation piping, hastily abandoned near a tree line. A single plastic tag, sun-bleached but legible, reading Sunbright H42, not for commercial sale. Sunbright was a known hybrid sunflower variety used mostly in seed development research, not for oil, not for snacks, and certainly not for commercial farming. The not for commercial sale designation marked it as genetically modified and restricted by federal license agreements. In short, these weren't everyday flowers. They were intellectual property. Microscope, enter the seed cops. Most people don't know that seed theft, is a serious federal offense. Even fewer know that there's a task force dedicated to it. The Intellectual Property Enforcement Program for Agricultural Genetics, often called the Seed Cops. When the tag from the field was matched to a private seed company in St. Louis, Missouri, red flags were raised. The company, Agri-Vance Genetics, confirmed that Sunbright H42 was one of their in-development strains, not yet approved for field testing outside of lab-controlled environments. Only 3 labs had clearance to grow it all under secure greenhouse conditions. None were in Kansas. Their conclusion: someone had illegally obtained a batch of proprietary GMO seeds, cultivated them in a hidden, unauthorized field, and likely harvested the data before government detection. This wasn't about the flowers. It was about genetic material and the potential to replicate or reverse engineer seed patents worth millions. Sunflower. What is sunflower espionage? At its heart, seed development is a high-stakes industry. Companies spend years engineering hybrid strains that can resist drought, pests, or yield higher oil content. These seeds are patented, locked down, and licensed with heavy restrictions. By stealing, planting, and sampling the results, rival companies or even foreign entities can leapfrog years of research. This crime, known in law enforcement as agroespionage, has quietly plagued the seed industry for decades. In this case, someone had illegally acquired patented seed, secretly cultivated it on federal land, monitored its growth and performance under real-world drought conditions, and removed all physical traces before detection. But how? And more critically, who had the kind of knowledge, access, and audacity to pull it off? Magnifying glass tilted left clues in the county office. In late August, a county clerk in Washington County flagged a curious series of filings dating back 3 years. 3 separate LLCs had filed for temporary land improvement permits in adjacent counties. All were registered to P.O. boxes in Oklahoma, and each had the same listed managing partner, DeYero. Further digging revealed that these LLCs had leased various small plots of rural land, always for short durations, always for drainage repair or soil testing, and always disappearing before follow-up inspections. This kind of operation pointed not to a lone farmer, but a coordinated testing effort. By the time federal investigators began probing deeper, the LLCs had dissolved. The P.O. boxes were empty, and DeYero had no digital footprint. But a search of federal agricultural grant databases unearthed a clue. A grant application submitted in 1996 for experimental sunflower drought research, denied due to lack of university affiliation. The applicant, Dr. Delia Yarrow, a former USDA soil scientist, dismissed in 1994 after whistleblowing on internal misappropriation of field trial data. Brain. Who was Dr. Yarrow? Delia Yarrow had once been a rising figure in federal agricultural circles, known for her field acumen, her innovative seed growth modeling, and her unwillingness to play politics. After her dismissal, she vanished from public research. But now it seemed she hadn't stopped experimenting. She had simply stepped out of the system and continued her work unofficially. The theory: Dr. Yarrow had acquired the Sunbright seeds through an anonymous informant, used shell companies to lease hidden parcels of land, and conducted unauthorized field trials without academic oversight. The goal wasn't theft. It was vindication, to prove that her approach to hybrid seed resilience could outperform corporate labs in actual, harsh conditions. Operation Sunflower wasn't corporate sabotage. It was scientific rebellion. So ask yourself, if the only way to test your ideas was to break the rules, would you risk everything to plant the truth? By the fall of 1998, Operation Sunflower had evolved from a land use violation into something far stranger and far more sophisticated. What began as a mystery about an unregistered field of genetically modified sunflowers now looked like the tip of a long-buried research iceberg. The federal agents working the case, mostly quiet analysts from the Department of Agriculture, and a small unit from the FBI's intellectual property branch, realized they weren't dealing with economic espionage or corporate theft. They were chasing a ghost, a disgraced soil scientist who had quietly built her own off-grid research empire beneath the radar of the U.S. agricultural establishment. Her name was Dr. Delia Yarrow, and she had made herself disappear almost a decade earlier. Test tube the rogue scientist theory. In October 1998, a memo circulated internally at USDA headquarters. Yarrow is not stealing data, she's generating it, unofficially but with precision. The question now is not how to arrest her. It's whether we're prepared to admit she's outperforming us. This was more than turf war. Yarrow had been right all along. Before her dismissal in 1994, she'd published several papers arguing that corporate GMO research ignored long-term soil compatibility, claiming that crops engineered for resilience were often tested under ideal conditions, yielding results that didn't hold up under stress. She advocated for drought integrity trials, growing seed strains in neglected soil, with minimal irrigation, and measuring nutrient recovery and pollination behaviors. Her ideas were praised by independent researchers, but quietly rejected by USDA leadership and biotech firms alike. Too unpredictable, too unpolished, too expensive to control. After a whistleblowing incident involving grant funding misappropriation for data smoothing, a claim that was, notably, never investigated, Yarrow was let go. And just like that, she vanished from the official record. A pattern emerges. Between 1995 and 1998, Yarrow, using a series of aliases and limited liability corporations, had leased over 60 parcels of abandoned land across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. Each lease followed the same pattern. Short-term soil testing agreement for 6 months. Filed through a nondescript LLC. Paid in full, often with cash or cashier's checks. Land left empty and restored upon inspection. But satellite images cross-referenced by Department of Interior analysts showed patterns of temporary cultivation on at least 37 of those parcels. Crop lines matched sunflower growth patterns. Irrigation equipment was visible in some frames. And in a handful of cases, crude sensor arrays were mounted near tree lines likely used to collect data on moisture levels, growth rates, and pollen travel. This wasn't rogue farming. This was an unauthorized, privately operated, region-wide seed trial spanning 3 states, multiple soil types, and harsh weather conditions. And it had remained undetected for nearly 4 years. Telephone, receiver, the interview that never happened. In early 1999, a journalist with the Prairie Ledger, a small agricultural paper out of Wichita, received an anonymous package. Inside, a printed research paper titled Unmodeled Drought Behaviors in Hybrid H42. A flash drive containing spreadsheets of growth data. A letter unsigned that read, "If they won't test it right, I will. If they won't let me back in, I'll work around them. The seeds don't care who's in charge, they just grow." The journalist traced the envelope to a mailbox drop in Emporia, Kansas, but by the time federal agents followed up, the box had been closed and the building leased to new tenants. No further correspondence ever came. The research paper, however, was verified by independent botanists as methodologically sound even ahead of its time in several respects. One botanist commented, "She was measuring things we didn't even think to measure in '98. Soil memory, pollinator interruption timing, intercropping shadows. It's like she had built her own private university and burned the campus afterward. DNA who stole the seeds. While Yarrow's experiments appeared to be self-funded and independently executed, one piece of the puzzle remained critical and potentially criminal. How did she get the Sunbright H42 seeds? The hybrid line, owned by Agrivance Genetics, was tightly controlled. Only 3 batches were ever distributed to research centers in Missouri, Illinois, and Belgium. All were under strict licensing agreements. But an audit conducted in late 1999 revealed something disturbing. One research assistant at Agrivance's Missouri lab had reported missing seed trays during a summer intern handover in 1996. The discrepancy was dismissed as a clerical error. That assistant, Rebecca Lane, left the company shortly after. She had attended Kansas State University. Her senior thesis advisor, Dr. Delia Yarrow. It was the first and only confirmed link between Yarrow and a direct breach of proprietary seed control. Still, no charges were filed. Rebecca Lane was never located for questioning. And Agrivance, perhaps fearing public exposure of its own security lapses, stopped cooperating with investigators in 2000. Globe showing Europe-Africa, the global ec. By the early 2000s, stories began surfacing of anonymous data submissions to academic journals in Europe and South America. Papers citing unauthorized field trials in North American prairie regions. Data sets with unusual formatting, referencing conditions not typically measured in mainstream seed development. One submission included a sunflower genome sequence labeled simply Y42 Echo. The scientific community never confirmed the source. But quietly, researchers started using her methods even if they never said her name. One agronomist admitted off the record, "We've all heard of Yarrow plots. It's like ghost data. You don't cite it, but you learn from it." Stop sign when the investigation ended. By 2001, Operation Sunflower was formally closed. No arrests. No prosecutions. No further sightings. The final report concluded. Subjects' activities ceased or adapted beyond detectable thresholds. Risk of reoccurrence minimal. Subject unlikely to present national security threat. Case remains unresolved but inactive. Privately, however, one investigator noted, "She didn't break into labs, she didn't publish under her name. She just used the land no one cared about." If that's a crime, we might be charging the wrong people. So as you consider this field planted, tested, erased, and forgotten, ask yourself, what counts as a crime? The theft of data, or the refusal to let knowledge grow without permission? And if the law blocks discovery, is rebellion still illegal if it's made out of sunflowers? It would have been easy for the world to forget Dr. Delia Yarrow. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dangerous. She didn't have accomplices, weapons, or an agenda that fit neatly into a courtroom. All she had was knowledge and a refusal to ask permission to use it. When Operation Sunflower was officially closed in 2001, a quiet sigh of relief moved through the corridors of government and industry. No formal charges meant no headlines, no press conferences, no questions about how a single person had outmaneuvered 3 agencies and an entire industry. But her impact, like seeds scattered in wind, didn't stop. Seedling the aftermath in the fields. Over the next decade, subtle traces of Yarrow's work began surfacing across agricultural research circles, not as citations, but as unexplained data jumps. Trials of sunflower hybrids began to report unexpected drought resilience in conditions previously thought too hostile. Volunteer growth crops sprouting in uncultivated areas started appearing near plots previously deemed abandoned. And perhaps most mysteriously, university researchers began receiving anonymous data drives, mailed from dead-end addresses, filled with field measurements collected with near-obsessive precision. One agronomist from Iowa State University reported, "It was better than anything we were doing. We couldn't publish it, but we used it quietly. She taught us what we weren't measuring." In several instances, these data packets included comparisons between Sunbright H42 and a modified variant, labeled YarrowH, detailing minor genetic deviations from the parent line changes that showed improved growth under variable moisture conditions. This shouldn't have been possible. Not without a lab. Not without funding. Not without someone like Yarrow. Postbox the untraceable letters. Between 2005 and 2010, select USDA field offices and several independent agricultural nonprofits received cryptic letters, all marked with a small sunflower stamp and no return address. Each contained a single-page crop report, soil nutrient metrics from Kansas plots long considered sterile, a short line of typed text, "The land is ready, they just don't want to believe it." These weren't threats, they weren't even pleas. They were reminders that the abandoned land still had potential if someone would just stop ignoring it. In one case, a field once used for nitrate disposal was later found to be showing natural remediation signs, a process predicted in one of the anonymous data sets 5 years earlier. Whoever was sending the packets, they were right. Magnifying glass tilted right a last glimpse. In 2012, an independent researcher studying pollinator behavior in northeast Oklahoma reported an encounter near a former Sunbright trial site. While conducting bee sampling, she came across a woman in her 60s, wearing a canvas hat and carrying a soil corer and a clipboard. They exchanged brief pleasantries. The woman asked about bee density. She made no mention of her name. Only when the researcher mentioned Yarrow data did the woman pause, smile faintly, and say, "The seeds remember, even when the people don't." When asked later why she didn't ask for her name, the researcher said, "I think I already knew. And I think she preferred I didn't." Test tube legacy without recognition. Dr. Delia Yarrow never published another paper under her name. She received no awards, no grant funding, no tenure track. But over the next 2 decades, several university agricultural departments quietly adopted her field trial methods. A private lab in Canada released a sunflower hybrid that bore a 99.6% genetic similarity to the YarrowH variant, though they denied any connection. A small cooperative farm in Kansas began teaching Yarrow-style testing as part of its regenerative farming curriculum. When asked if the name was a tribute, the instructor simply said, "No one told us to call it that. It's just what people started calling it." File folder final notes from the case file. The last pages of the Operation Sunflower case file, archived in a secure but rarely accessed USDA digital vault, contain a set of notes from a retiring investigator. He wrote, "She didn't do it for money. She didn't do it to sabotage. She didn't even do it to be remembered. She did it because the soil still mattered to her. And the rest of us forgot." He ended with a question not meant for courtrooms or committee hearings. If every abandoned field might still hold value, what does that say about the people we abandon too? Sunrise over mountains. Closing thoughts. Dr. Yarrow never asked for forgiveness. She never confessed. She never needed to. Her crime, if you could call it that, was one of resistance through research, of choosing to continue contributing even after the institutions that once supported her shut the door. And in the end, it wasn't her silence that changed things. It was her persistence. She never planted flags. She planted seeds. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine a field under moonlight, quiet, abandoned, officially useless. But somewhere just below the surface, something is still growing. And the question lingers: how many other truths are quietly blooming in places we've forgotten to check? On the corner of 8th Avenue and Maple Street in a mid-sized Midwestern city, there sat a laundromat that no one seemed to notice until federal investigators realized it had been reporting the same exact revenue numbers for nearly 7 years. The place was called Bright Wash, one of those 24-hour coin laundries with humming fluorescent lights and plastic chairs that always seemed sticky no matter how often they were wiped down. The exterior was faded yellow, its signage half-lit, and the machines inside looked like they hadn't been updated since the early 1980s. Customers did use it, but not many. Other newer laundromats in the area had better machines, better pricing, even free Wi-Fi. Yet Bright Wash kept filing city tax returns, reporting $22,470 in annual cash income. Not $22,469. Not $22,471. The same number, year after year. That oddity was the first thread pulled. What unraveled was a story of cash laundering, small-time organized crime, and a conspiracy so quiet it almost escaped notice, hidden in the hum of dryers that rarely spun. Receipt: the first red flag. The case began in 2004, when a junior tax auditor flagged Bright Wash for improbable income consistency. Small businesses fluctuate weather, foot traffic, seasons, repairs. Coin laundries especially, with their dependency on local housing conditions, rarely report exact same-year revenue. The auditor filed it as a statistical anomaly and moved on. But when another auditor, reviewing unrelated housing data, cross-referenced water usage, things didn't add up. Reported income: $22,470. Reported water consumption: enough to serve nearly 200 households. Either the machines were running 24/7 without pause, or someone was running water for reasons other than washing clothes. Droplet: the water mystery. Investigators began surveillance. Over the course of 3 weeks, they found the laundromat had fewer than 10 paying customers per day. Yet machines ran constantly, often unattended. Security cameras showed men, sometimes the same men, sometimes new ones, hauling in duffel bags, staying briefly, then leaving with plastic containers. At first glance, it resembled routine maintenance. But one officer noted something strange. They never brought in detergent, never left with folded clothes. Dollar banknote following the coins. Inside, Bright Wash's coin machines were genuine, but heavily modified. A forensic inspection revealed they contained false chambers that could be loaded with cash from outside sources. The machines would cycle the bills through, issue false receipts, and count them as coin laundry revenue. Essentially, the laundromat wasn't cleaning clothes. It was cleaning money. For every $10,000 deposited into the system, a portion was disguised as quarters run through the washers and dryers, logged as revenue, and reintroduced into local banks as legitimate small business cash flow. The scale of the scheme. When federal agents finally secured access to the laundromat's accounts, they discovered Bright Wash had laundered an estimated $4.2 million between 1997 and 2005. The operation was carefully calibrated. Never more than $25,000 a year declared. Always under the threshold that would trigger automatic IRS audits. Reported as steady to avoid suspicion of growth spurts. The conspirators had found the sweet spot between invisibility and believability. Who owned Bright Wash? Officially, Bright Wash was registered to a man named Arthur "Artie" Kellerman, a retired truck driver in his 70s. Artie had lived in the same small house since the 1960s, drove a rusted pickup, and was known for his weekly bingo games at the local Veterans Hall. When questioned, Artie claimed, "I've never set foot in that laundromat. Someone puts my name on the papers, I sign them, they pay me a little rent check every month. I thought it was legit." Digging deeper, investigators found that the true operators were a loose-knit group with ties to small-scale narcotics distribution and counterfeit cigarette smuggling. They needed a steady, boring cash business to cycle profits. Bright Wash was perfect. Brain the psychology of a front. What made Bright Wash successful wasn't its brilliance but its ordinariness. It was too small to attract national attention. Too boring for local journalists to cover. Too predictable for auditors to prioritize. As one investigator put it, they hid in plain sight by being aggressively mediocre. The laundromat was shabby, uninviting, and unimpressive, but in that neglect was safety. No one cared enough to look closely. Magnifying glass tilted left the turning point. The conspiracy might have continued indefinitely if not for a plumbing mishap in late 2005. A burst pipe forced emergency city inspectors to enter the property. Behind a false wall they found industrial water pumps rerouting excess water use, stacks of empty detergent boxes staged for appearances, and a small locked office containing ledgers marked only with sunflower symbols, a possible nod to coded accounting systems seen in other laundering schemes. That office, humid, dim, and cluttered, was the first undeniable proof that Bright Wash wasn't in the laundry business at all. So now the question became, who was behind the sunflower ledgers? And how had they managed to wash millions through a place where the dryers barely worked? It wasn't the water usage. It wasn't the revenue reports. It wasn't even the fake coin-fed machines. In the end, the key to unraveling the Bright Wash conspiracy came from a series of small, worn-out spiral notebooks found inside a rusted filing cabinet, wedged behind an intentionally misaligned washer unit. Each notebook had a sunflower symbol drawn on the cover. Inside, columns of figures, handwritten in ballpoint pen. No names, no dates, just numbers, odd letter codes, and the same pattern repeating again and again. S1, 3,700. S2, 1,250. RZA, 2,500. S1, 3,700. S2, 1,250. It looked at first glance like gibberish, or maybe inventory. But to the FBI's Forensic Accounting Task Force, this was something else. A ledger system designed to be read only by insiders. And it was built around sunflowers. Sunflower, a code hidden in crops. The sunflower motif, which at first seemed odd and out of place, would take on a deeper meaning as investigators cross-referenced the notebooks with past records from other laundromat and cash-based businesses in the region. In the Midwest criminal underworld, especially in areas where traditional gang hierarchies didn't exist, small-time crime syndicates often used agricultural imagery as code sunflowers, wheat, corn, even soybeans to label different operations or fields of revenue. In this scheme, S1 likely referred to the main cash source, believed to be a counterfeit tobacco operation in southern Missouri. S2 pointed to a secondary stream, possibly from illegal prescription drug sales. RZ entries, possibly rotation zones, seemed to match delivery cycles. What mattered wasn't the specifics. What mattered was that each entry aligned to laundromat activity, and every time a particular code was entered, a batch of machines would run empty. Soap machines with no purpose. By now, the FBI had begun installing covert surveillance, and the findings were clear. Machines ran on a timer. No clothes were loaded. No detergent entered the drums. Each wash or dry cycle was a cover for recorded cash intake, represented in the ledgers as a clean transaction. Over 85% of machine usage was fabricated. Yet quarters still clinked, machines still hummed, lights still blinked. The illusion of business constant, rhythmic, unquestioned rolled on. Busts in silhouette the operators behind the front. The sunflower notebooks eventually led to name. Samuel "Sammy" Villaro, a former vending machine technician turned small-time fixer. Villaro, 52, had no violent record, no gang tattoos, no known affiliations. But he had served time in the 1980s for fraud and had once worked with a now-defunct ATM servicing company in Kansas City. His specialty: machine tampering, modifying coin-fed units to count cash that never entered. Investigators uncovered that Sammy had formed a shell company in 1996. Midwest Servco, LLC, listed as a vending machine and appliance repair service. This company had serviced at least 6 other laundromats, all of which coincidentally went bankrupt within 3-5 years after reporting steady but unexplainable growth. Each of them had a similar layout, modified coin machines, and a sunflower sketch somewhere inside a drawer or office. Dollar banknote, a money laundering method built on boredom. What made the bright wash conspiracy work wasn't technical genius. It was human psychology. Laundromats are cash-based, lightly regulated, visually repetitive, and boring. And so the perfect laundering machine wasn't hidden, it was disguised as routine. One FBI analyst remarked, "You don't notice the 5th dryer spinning empty because the 4th one is too. You don't question the cash volume because you assume someone else did." It's the same psychological effect used in pickpocketing. Hide the theft in the crowd, and no one looks at your hands. Counterclockwise arrows button the rotation scheme. Here, how the operation worked. Dirty cash from illegal sales or black market activities was funneled into duffel bags. Operators, sometimes low-level runners, entered the laundromat during low-traffic hours. The cash was fed into false-back coin machines, which recorded the deposit but didn't actually convert it into quarters. At set intervals, machines would run ghost wash-dry cycles, matching the ledger entries. These fabricated transactions were logged as legitimate business income. Receipts were printed, records filed, taxes paid just enough to appear honest. Over time, the money was filtered through business accounts and reintroduced into the financial system as clean, small business income. The genius: they paid taxes. Not too much, just enough. Paying small taxes on fake income gave the illusion of full compliance. Paperclip when the system turned on itself. The final nail in the conspiracy came not from a wiretap or sting operation, but from a routine audit of city water bills. Bright Wash had filed a water leak reimbursement request, citing an accidental drain malfunction that cost them thousands of gallons over a billing cycle. The problem: they claimed the leak occurred on a date when no one was recorded entering or exiting the property, and video surveillance proved the facility had been inactive. It triggered a red flag that led to a full investigation and a search warrant for the hidden back office, where the notebooks were finally found. In trying to claim a refund for water they never used, they'd exposed the fact that their machines had no real customers at all. So then ask yourself, how many other laundromats, diners, vape shops, or storage units, quietly churning in every town, aren't there to do business at all? What if they're just there to look like they do? By the summer of 2006, Bright Wash wasn't just a place with humming dryers and the scent of warm lint. It was officially classified by federal investigators as a criminal enterprise masquerading as an appliance. And yet, when agents finally raided the laundromat, no one was there. No customers, no operators, just rows of half-rusted machines spinning emptily, the fluorescent lights flickering over cracked tile floors, and a digital timer beeping its slow, mechanical countdown. It was like walking into a ghost story powered by quarters. But the ghosts, as it turned out, had names. Balance the legal tangle. Following the seizure of the sunflower notebooks and the breakdown of the laundering process, a grand jury was convened in late 2006. Over the course of 18 months, the investigation would result in 4 indictments, including Samuel "Sammy" Villaro, 2 plea deals from former runners, and 1 person, the original owner, Artie Kellerman, who was cleared entirely of wrongdoing. Kellerman, the elderly man whose name had been used to register Bright Wash, was found to be a classic cutout, a harmless placeholder with no operational involvement. When shown photos of Sammy Villaro during questioning, he simply shook his head. Never seen him, but he always sent the checks on time. Sammy's operation had used layers of plausible deniability. The owner didn't know the manager. The manager didn't handle cash. The runners didn't talk to each other. And the paper trail looped through shell corporations that dissolved every 18 months. This web of silence and confusion made prosecution painstakingly slow. Adult Balance: What Happened to Sammy. Sammy Villaro was eventually convicted in 2009 on 2 counts of money laundering and fraudulent accounting. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and fined just under $300,000, a fraction of what authorities estimated had moved through Bright Wash. In his plea agreement, he admitted to designing the false coin systems, creating the ledger format, and overseeing the ghost wash timer rotations. But Sammy refused to identify his cash suppliers or who the laundered money originally belonged to. He ended his testimony with one final sentence: "I just cleaned the money, not where it came from." And in truth, he may not have known. That was part of his system's genius. The collapse of Bright Wash. After the raid, Bright Wash sat vacant for almost a year. Graffiti began to cover its yellowed exterior. The coin slots rusted. The lights stopped flickering. But it became something else too, a minor urban legend. Teenagers joked that the machine still ran at night, that ghosts of criminals still spun in the dryers, that the building hummed even when the power was off. In 2010, it was sold at auction to a family-owned food truck business. Today, it's a quiet taco joint. The sign still reads Bright Wash. Locals insisted they keep it that way. Cityscape: the bigger picture, laundromats as fronts. Bright Wash wasn't the first laundromat used to launder money. It wasn't even the most sophisticated. But it was remarkable in its minimalism: no complex tech, no violence, no elaborate fraud. Just a few coin machines, some notebooks, and the simple expectation that no one would ever look closely. After the case, several federal task forces revisited hundreds of laundromats across the Midwest. Dozens were investigated, some were cleared, a handful quietly closed. The phrase "sunflower site" became internal slang for any cash business suspected of financial activity that didn't match its foot traffic. One agent summed it up: the genius wasn't in the machines. It was in betting that no one cared about laundromats anymore. Thought balloon reflection: the cost of ignoring the mundane. Bright Wash didn't involve cartel shootouts. There were no daring getaways, no high-speed chases or mafia don confessions. It was boring, painfully so. And that's why it worked. In a culture obsessed with flashy crimes, slow one's the quiet drip of illicit money filtered through something as benign as a dryer often go unnoticed. But think about it. How many businesses have no customers but never close? How many storefronts always seem open, but you never see anyone inside? How often do you assume that something ordinary is just that? Tonight, as you walk past your own neighborhood laundromat, ask yourself, is someone folding towels inside? Or is the hum of those machines covering the sound of something else being cleaned? You probably don't remember the name Lyle Pennington. There's no Dateline special about him. No documentaries. No police footage of him being dragged away in cuffs. Yet, for nearly a decade, from 1992 to 2001, Pennington quietly pulled off one of the most technically precise and methodically dull crime sprees in American history. He never broke in. He never left a trace. He simply used the keys people gave him and waited. This is the story of a man who made his living not by defeating locks, but by understanding the people who trusted them too much. Toolbox the locksmith from nowhere. Lyle Pennington operated under the name Pennington Lock and Key, a mobile locksmith service that served 4 counties across rural Indiana and southern Ohio. The business was legitimate technically. He was licensed. He passed background checks. He answered customer calls himself and drove a white panel van with hand-painted blue lettering. His tagline, "If it locks, I know it." He did routine work. Home lockouts, rekeys after divorces, safe openings for elderly clients, and the occasional commercial deadbolt replacement. Customers remembered him as polite, quiet, and efficient. He always wore a pressed polo shirt tucked in. He never smoked. He often gave discounts to seniors. No one suspected that he was documenting every lock he touched, every pin combination, every pattern in human behavior. Because Lyle wasn't just fixing locks. He was cataloging them. Open book, the little green notebooks. What brought Lyle down in the end wasn't a daring heist. It wasn't even a criminal complaint. It was a garage sale. In 2001, after Lyle's sudden disappearance, a new homeowner cleaning out a storage shed on a property he'd recently purchased discovered a sealed Rubbermaid container filled with business receipts, brass lock blanks, photos of front doors, and a series of small green notebooks labeled only by zip code. Inside each notebook was a handwritten list. Addresses, log types, key codes, dog ownership status, typical work hours of residents, whether security systems were visible, whether the resident seemed forgetful. The notebook stretched back nearly 10 years. Houses a crime without entry. What the FBI eventually pieced together was this. Pennington used his legitimate locksmith calls as reconnaissance missions. When someone hired him to rekey a house, he didn't just install the new lock, he documented the entire property. He made spare keys on the spot, using a concealed duplicator mounted beneath his mobile workstation. He cataloged patterns, who left town for work, who had delivery schedules, whose porch light flicked on at dusk. Then sometimes weeks, sometimes years later, he would return, typically in the middle of the day, using the copied key to enter while no one was home. No broken windows. No kicked-in doors. No alarm triggers. He knew exactly which locks were vulnerable, which weren't alarmed, and which homes had hidden safes. Brain the psychology of trust. Locksmiths occupy a strange space in society, both trusted and invisible. They arrive when you're locked out, when you've lost control of your own space. You hand them your most vulnerable moment, and they fix it. Pennington understood this. He wasn't a thrill seeker. He wasn't even greedy. He stole conservatively, quietly, and only from homes he believed wouldn't notice right away. Investigators later determined most of his thefts involved cash, coins, and unregistered valuables, rarely electronics, never anything large or easily traceable. He avoided jewelry unless it looked inherited and unappraised. He never took anything that would be reported missing within 24 hours. In some homes, he stole twice, waiting years between visits. Magnifying glass tilted left while no one noticed. What made Pennington's crimes almost undetectable was how unexciting they were. He targeted the elderly, the divorced, the recently widowed, the distracted. He counted on foggy memories and busy lives to blur the timeline. Did I misplace that envelope of cash? Wasn't there a coin jar in the closet? I must have lost that ring during the move. Most victims never filed reports. And those who did, they were usually dismissed due to lack of forced entry. After all, locks weren't broken. Doors weren't jimmied. Nothing was ransacked. Without signs of burglary, the police assumed nothing happened. Paperclip the first case file. Only one case buried in a 1999 sheriff's office report ever listed Lyle Pennington by name prior to the investigation. An elderly woman, Dorothy LaRue, reported that someone had stolen a few $100s from a floor safe she rarely used. She had her locks changed 3 years prior by Pennington after her husband passed. When asked if she suspected anyone, she'd said, "No, but that locksmith man, he was awfully quiet." The case went nowhere. No forced entry. No evidence. But her address was listed in one of Pennington's notebooks. It was coded with SB single person, FR floor safe right, W93 works 93, and the word slow. That word appeared in more than a dozen other entries. So now you have to wonder, if someone had access to your logs, would you even know if they came back? When the FBI began mapping the addresses from Pennington's notebooks, a chilling realization emerged. The crime spanned 80-plus miles, 4 counties, and nearly a decade, yet there were no 911 calls, no active investigations, and not one consistent pattern of suspicion. It was, to put it bluntly, the quietest crime wave they had ever encountered. The only connecting thread. Each home had, at one point, called Pennington lock and key, and each had entrusted him to protect their home, with the very lock he'd later used to walk right in. Whirled the map of memory. Using the zip code notebooks as a reference, federal agents and local law enforcement traced addresses using utility records, land titles, and Pennington's own client receipts. Out of the 312 total entries listed across 8 notebooks, 72 addresses had owners who recalled small, unexplained losses. 29 admitted they never noticed anything missing, but confirmed the details written matched their homes. Only 4 had ever filed a police report, all of which had gone cold. The rest, either the homeowners had moved, passed away, or didn't respond. But one address stood out. House the subdivision that knew. In a quiet development in Springfield Township, a small cul-de-sac of retirees had collectively hired Pennington in 1996 to install deadbolts as part of a neighborhood security upgrade. Over a single weekend, he installed locks on all 12 homes. By 2001, 5 residents had reported cash missing. 2 had lost family jewelry. 1 had a rare coin collection go missing during a remodel. No one connected the dots, but Pennington had. He'd labeled the subdivision Cluster 3. Each home had its own coded notes, and the entries showed return visits staggered over 5 years. The keys that opened everything. when agents examined Pennington's personal van, which had been impounded and sold at auction. After he fled, they found hidden in a panel behind the driver's seat over 600 unmarked keys, a portable duplicator, dozens of small manila envelopes labeled only by address numbers. Each envelope contained a blank key, a hand-drawn sketch of a lock faceplate, and an R value believed to indicate resistance level, e.g., alarm systems, nosy neighbors, or locked safes. His system was obsessively organized. He'd even kept notes on which homes had dogs, nodding, barks only at mail, friendly to strangers, or outside only, early riser. It became clear Pennington had built not just a criminal map, but a psychological grid of trust and vulnerability. Speech ballooned the profile of a patient thief. FBI profiler Elaine Gerald, who studied the notebooks in detail, remarked, "He wasn't opportunistic, he was methodical. Most thieves get sloppy, they escalate, but Pennington was a man obsessed with the idea of not being noticed." His crimes were non-violent, low-dollar, and strategically spaced apart. He rarely returned to the same area in less than 2 years. In psychological terms, Pennington exhibited traits of a compulsive documentarian, more interested in the system than the loot. Some suspected he took things not out of need, but out of a desire to prove that he could without ever being seen. He was less burglar, more archivist of invisible crimes. Luggage, the disappearance. In early 2001, just before the garage sale discovery that would unravel everything, Pennington abruptly closed his business. He canceled scheduled appointments, disconnected his business line, and disappeared. There was no forwarding address, no car accident, no missing persons report. He simply vanished. The home he'd rented in Ohio had been vacated in the middle of the night, rent paid in full. Neighbors recalled seeing the locksmith van parked for one last evening. By morning, it was gone. He left no trace except for the keys and notebooks, accidentally forgotten in a backyard shed he used for storage. Hammer was there, an accomplice. Some investigators suspected Pennington didn't work alone. Certain burglaries occurred while he was known to be at other appointments. A few residents described a different man arriving in the van for follow-up visits. The handwriting in the final notebook showed subtle inconsistencies: pressure, slant, spacing, as if someone else had begun maintaining the records. But there was no evidence of a second locksmith. If there was an accomplice, he was either a quiet understudy or a fabrication planted by Pennington himself to mislead investigators. Either way, the trail went cold. Paperclip: the cases that changed. The aftermath of the Pennington investigation triggered policy reviews across locksmith associations in multiple states. By 2003, Indiana passed new regulations requiring dual-party lock installation for sensitive jobs, mandatory record-keeping of all duplicated keys, random audits of mobile locksmith services. It also led to the creation of the silent entry Profile A crime classification for burglaries with no sign of forced access and no evidence of tampering. So now ask yourself, if someone walked into your home, opened the drawer you forgot you had, and took only what you might not notice for weeks, would you ever know? By the time the full breadth of Lyle Pennington's operation became clear, the crime itself was already over. The homes were sold. The victims had moved or died. The locks had been changed again, this time by people who would never know they were replacing hardware once compromised. No alarms had ever been tripped. No doors had ever been forced. And in the final twist of irony, not one single key was ever used as evidence in court. Because by the time law enforcement understood what Pennington had done, he was already gone. Door the vanishing locksmith. Despite coordinated searches across state lines and within the locksmithing community, no confirmed sighting of Pennington was ever reported after 2001. There were rumors. A man fitting his description was seen at a lock trade show in Tulsa in 2003. Another claimed he ran into a quiet guy who knew too much about floor safes at a motel near Baton Rouge. One alleged he was working under an assumed name in a small-town auto shop. None of these could be verified. Authorities believed Pennington had used his own knowledge of access, false identity creation, and quiet movement to disappear permanently, perhaps even living off the modest cash he'd accumulated during his decade-long spree. It was never about millions. It was about invisibility. And Lyle Pennington had, at last, picked the lock of his own disappearance. Briefcase the incomplete file. As the FBI closed out its formal casework, they marked Pennington's file as inactive subject at large. The findings included 300-plus suspected victim addresses, 140 confirmed duplications, estimated theft totals between $175,000 and $250,000, though exact losses were impossible to verify. No violent offenses. No known associates. No fingerprints in national databases. Pennington left behind no digital footprint. He had no email. No cell phone records. He operated exclusively in paper, phone calls, and quiet visits. To this day, his last known signature is a carbon copy receipt for a safe rekey in rural Indiana dated March 14, 2001. Locked with key, the locks we don't question. After Pennington, a deeper issue came into focus. How often do we trust someone simply because they show up in a uniform with a clipboard? Locksmith, plumbers, technicians. We open our doors, show them the very systems meant to protect us, and assume they are who they say they are. We don't double-check licenses. We don't ask to see their tools. We rarely follow up after they leave. Pennington didn't defeat locks. He defeated assumptions. Brain psychological legacy. Criminologists studying Pennington's case note that his crimes reflect a unique blend of strategic patience, low-emotion theft, and hyperspecific moral lines. He never entered homes while people were inside. He never took sentimental objects unless they were financially valuable. He never ransacked or vandalized. And that, experts argue, was what made his theft so successful. People want villains to be obvious, one analyst wrote. They want force, anger, violence. Pennington was none of those things. He was method, silence, and politeness. Bricks the walls we build. In the years following the case, dozens of locksmithing blogs and training programs began incorporating Pennington protocols, emphasizing ethical lock handling, documentation, and customer safety. One national training organization even released a red flag guide for locksmith clients, including questions like, did your technician offer duplicate keys without your request? Were photographs taken of your door hardware? Was the locksmith unusually interested in your schedule or routines? These might seem paranoid, but then again, so did the idea of someone copying your keys and waiting 5 years to use them. Luggage, where is he now? Some believe Pennington is living off the grid. Others suspect he's dead. A few think he changed identities and lives modestly in some small town, cash paid and untraceable. No body was found. No death certificate issued. No social security activity has ever been tied to his name or likeness. And while the trail has long since gone cold, the locks he once installed are still out there, aged, replaced, forgotten. Some of them may still turn with his keys.